Good morning. Okay, so with Yaakov Hol Tzedakah, we begin our journey as we're about to enter the month of Cheshvan from Tishrei. And as I said in the last class, what I'd like to do, I think the consensus is good with me, which is to learn Samach Vov next. Obviously, it's informed by what we've learned in Ayin Beis, and obviously also what I wrote in the essay in connecting the two Hemshechim. And like all Chassidus, every mimer, and especially a Hemshech, leads you, the rivers of the mimer lead you, and the Hemshech leads you to many other mimer. But what I did want to do before we begin that Hemshech was to go over, as I said, just to give an overview, a skira klolis, as it's called, an overview of the entire structure of Chassidus Chabad, meaning each Rebbe in his generation, what he produced and what role it plays when you look at the whole picture. I don't know if anyone's ever done it comprehensively. I've done it here and there. You may recall a number of years ago on Hey Tavis, which is, of course, a celebration of books. I did a type of narrative from the Baal Shem Tov all the way to the Rebbe in demonstrating what each one contributed. So that can complement what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do this more. What I'm going to do now, this overview is going to be more through the actual books and texts. There I did it more thematically. I took a theme, a central theme of Chassidus and Achdus Hashem, the interface between godliness and existence, and went through from the Baal Shem Tov all the way to the Rebbe. That's recorded, and we can post a link to it as well. So what I'd like to do now is go over the general structure, especially through the context of, again, the books and the literature. So you get a good sense of what each Rebbe produced, and more importantly, the evolution of how it evolved from one to the next. One of my dreams, among many, is to one day maybe direct, if I don't do it myself, but direct others, and maybe with the use of AI could help, to actually take the Maimorim, the themes that are discussed by the Alter Rebbe as he established Chassidus Chabad, and how each Maimer or each theme took on new shape and how it evolved through the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, and essentially establish all the central themes, maybe 300, 500 themes. I'm not even sure how many there are, maybe even less, depending how broad you go. So that would also be, I think, a tremendous contribution, because you can then see, here you learn the Maimorim, each one of them is all over the place, and it's not so easy to always formulate the connection between them all. But the idea came to me actually when we started learning Ayin Beis, because that's what the Rebbe Rashab did in Ayin Beis. He very much took themes and connected them, basically connecting, I would say, either all or almost all the Maimonic Chassidus and their central themes in this long magnum opus, this long Hemshech of over 1,474 pages, 1,472 pages, whatever the amount is. And he did that. And as we discussed many times, the different Maimorim upon which he based things, but more than that, he connected them, because it's one long Hemshech. It wasn't like separate Maimorim. So there's one long flow. So that's what I like to do now. I also want to note that Chav Cheshvan, which is in around 3 weeks from now, is the Rebbe Rashab's birthday. Or Tafresh Chof Aleph, he was born. So that would be his 165th birthday, I believe. Yeah. And as well, it's 120th anniversary from Samach Vov. I just realized that as well. Tafresh Samach Vov was 1905. It began, and now we are in 2025. And the Tafresh Samach Vov of the Hebrew, Tafshin Pei Vov. So 120 years. So just some trivia, if you wish, or whatever you want to call it. So with that said, unless somebody wants to ask something or comment, I'd like to get into this overview. And then, as was essentially, you all felt felt important, the consensus, as I said, was Samach Vav. I said, I'm happy to do anything. So Samach Vav it is, and we'll learn Samach Vav after we do this overview. Anybody wants to comment or question anything about what I said right now, please do. And then I'll take it from there. Okay. Good. We will have a meeting when we can schedule soon, shortly, about the Siyum of Ayin Beis, how to celebrate that, how to publicize it. And in general, we want to also publicize this new shir, and we have to figure out branding as well. Our group is called Ayin Beis. Maybe it should just remain Ayin Beis because that's really our entry point, but we can discuss that as well. Okay, as far as the overview goes, so stop, take a short pause, and if it was a Fabrengen, we'd sing a niggin. We're not going to sing a niggin right now, but what we'll do is take a short pause, and I'll begin this overview. As I said, the overview is primarily the actual texts, not so much the themes. Obviously, as we've learned through Ayin Beis, the central theme of Chassidus, or Torah in general, is the Hashem Echad. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, the Achdus of how we reconcile, of how we integrate and synthesize existence and godliness. And that's not just a philosophical question, it's also a psychological one that has impact and ramifications in every aspect of our lives. Are you going to live a selfish, self-interest driven life, or are you going to live a divine-centric life, meaning mission-centric, why you're here in this world? In other words, living in this physical world and making a dira b'tachtein. That is the central theme of all of Chassidus. Now, of course, to do that, you have a whole Seder Ishtalshelus, we have a whole process and formulas, which is all part of the process of the elevating, the creation of existence, and then in turn, our transforming existence, step by step by step. Like we spoke about in the last class on on Sunday, we spoke about Bereshis. So the beginning of the Torah, that's what it talks about. God creates a world with a purpose, and then places the human being on earth a human being created in the divine image, with the power of a neshama within a body, in order to transform the body, the animal soul, the whole physical world into a home for the divine. So that's the central theme of all of Torah. So Migdash means obviously the physical temple, but Migdash refers to the general idea of turning the physical world into a home and a temple and a sanctuary for the divine. Okay. Now, Chassidus, of course, especially Chassidus Chabad, lays out a comprehensive formula of how to do so. Now, I'm going to begin now with the Alter Rebbe, even though I'll say a few words about the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. So generally speaking, the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mizrich, especially the Baal Shem Tov, is considered the Miyasid, the founder of Chassidus Klolis, we call it. General Chassidus. The Maggid, his student, continued that. The Alter Rebbe is called the Miyasid of Chassidus Chabad. So within Chassidus Klolis itself, all-encompassing Chassidus, there was the school of Chabad. And that begins the Alter Rebbe and the 7 generations that followed from there, as I mentioned, all the way to the Rebbe, the Der Ashvi. Chassidus Chabad, as the name suggests, takes the Chassidus Klolis of the Baal Shem Tov and turns it into a comprehensive blueprint. Chabad is, of course, cognitive and intellectual, but it's not just Chabad. It's a mind, cognitive, and emotional process, but it's driven by a mind that's contemplating and integrating godliness. Like we learned at length in the Maimer HaMakbila Shevis was literally about that. That you take Shema Yisrael, you take prayer, you contemplate on the divine unity, and ultimately it impacts even the animal soul, not just to understand God, but also to feel and emote about God. V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, which follows Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. V'ahavtas b'chol levavcha, b'shnei yitzarecha, both sides, the animal soul, the divine soul and the animal soul. B'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Or in the pasuk that we learned in Ayin Beis, v'yadaita yem, v'ashavesa levavecha, ki Hashem hu alekim, v'shamayim emal v'al metochas einait. So you have the v'yadaita, like das of Chabad, just like as you have das alikei avicha, das, which of course includes Chochmah and Bina as well. And then v'ashavesa levavecha, like das alikei avicha, v'avduhu b'leiv of Sholom, that the das brings levav, heart, v'shavesa levavecha, that you should integrate it, internalize it in your heart. Now what? That Hashem alekim b'shamayim emal v'aretz metachas einod. So you see here, right there, the two steps: the contemplative, cognitive side, the adaita, and the second half, which is the shavesa levavecha. When we speak about Mashiach, we say, Mola Oretz Deis Hashem Kamayim Le'yam Mechasim. The world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Again, Deya, like the waters cover the sea. And obviously, when you have knowledge of God, it transforms, refines, and transforms you to be an agent of the divine in this world. So that's essentially, as it says in some of the sikhs, it says the Baal Shem Tov taught that every Jew can access God and serve God, meaning not just a scholar, but everyone, because they have a neshama, a nefesh, a etzema neshama. The Alter Rebbe showed how they do so. And one of the examples given is that the Baal Shem Tov gave us a ladder, and the Alter Rebbe taught us how to climb the ladder, if I recall correctly. That's the moshel. So in that sense, Chassidus Klolis lays the groundwork, and that's why you'll see the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov and the Torah of the Maggid is very much nekudus, short. The longest Torah of Baal Shem Tov is maybe one column on a page, 2 columns, but relatively short. Maggid is similar. They both spoke. They did not write. They wrote some letters, but their Torah was primarily spoken and was written down by their students. You look at the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, even the Alter Rebbe compared to the Mittler Rebbe is much longer than the Maimorim of the Baal Shem Tov. The Mittler Rebbe takes it to a whole other level. But the Alter Rebbe, a Maimer is a Maimer. Can be one, there are the short Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, especially from the earlier years, but later you find a Maimer is going to be 5, 6, 7 pages, sometimes a little shorter. The Mittler Rebbe takes that and turns it into 30 pages, 25 pages. But the point is that this began a more harchava, expanding. So the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid gave us more or less the kernels, if you wish, the seeds. And there have been essays written and studies made of tracing the Alter Rebbe's ideas in the Maggid and the Baal Shem Tov. It's a discussion of its own, which I don't want to go into here. But there have been discussions. People wrote different essays on that to see how the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, of course, was the teacher of the Alter Rebbe. The Baal Shem Tov was the teacher of the Maggid. To see how the Maggid and the Baal Shem Tov is pretty clear. There's a many overlapping, and you could see the similar ideas and the similar style. But the Alter Rebbe, of course, started a whole new approach. Tanya, again, is not Nekudis. It's still concentrated, but it's 53 chapters, just the first volume, Kutamorim, the first section of Tanya. Okay, so with that said, this also corresponds, as we've talked a number of times, that the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid are Keser in the spheres, with the Baal Shem Tov being Atik, and the Maggid being Arich, and it fits very well, because Keser is like the seeds. It's still super conscious state. It's not yet brought out the consciousness of Chochmah, Bina, Das, and so on, that Chassidus Chabad elaborates and develops. Alter Rebbe, we're told, is Chochmah. So that's already the beginning of consciousness, still a spark compared to Bina, but it's already a state that you can consciously relate to. And as I said, relative to the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, Chochmah is not superconscious. It's something, a revealed intelligence. As we'll discuss momentarily, the Mittler Rebbe expanded upon it. So let's talk about the Alter Rebbe now. Now, the Alter Rebbe was born in the year Kahos, Tov Kuf Hey, which corresponds to the year 1745. I believe, 1745, yeah, would be Tov Kufay. Now, his early years, he had not known about Chassidus. His father was a secret disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. But when the Alter Rebbe was born, the Baal Shem Tov instructed that he not bring his son, his newborn son, Shnei Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, to the Baal Shem Tov because he belongs to the Magid. So the Alter Rebbe may have seen the Baal Shem Tov, but he never really was exposed to him in any revealed way. So that is, again, I'm mentioning some key points, but I'm not going to go into long detail because I don't want to do a full biography here. I'm only doing enough to understand the landscape of Chassidus. So the next thing is like this. So the Alter Rebbe did meet the Magid. Initially, he wasn't sure whether he would stay there and whether he would, but he ultimately was impressed. One of the ways the Alter Rebbe said it, that learning, he knew how to learn. He had two options. Should he go to Vilna to learn more? Or should he stay in Mizrich, where the Magid was, and learn how to daven? So his reaction was, his response to himself, as he was deliberating on it, was that learning he learned, he knows how to learn. Not, God forbid, in a humble way he stated, of course. But davening he doesn't know. So he stayed in the Mizrich. There's a whole story of how first he was ready to leave, but then he heard something the Maggid said in learning, and he realized that he's dealing here with a giant of giants. So this would be when the Alter Rebbe was, I would say, in his 20s, I believe. Now, as the Maggid passed away in Tov Kuf Lamed Gimel. And obviously, as long as the Maggid was alive, he was the Rebbe. And he had many disciples. These include the Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, all the great people you hear about, different Rebbes that were sent to different cities. Each one started their own, so to speak, dynasty. The Alter Rebbe was charged with writing the Shulchan Aruch. But then Chassidus Chabad began to develop in the Tov Kuf Lameds, basically. That would be the equivalent of the 1770s, 1780, Tov Kuf Lamed, Tov Kuf Mem. That's when the Alter Rebbe began to develop Chassidus Chabad, teaching it, speaking about it. But real Maimorim, or written documents, did not begin till, of course, the Tanya, which is Tov Kuf Nun Ches, or Tov Kuf Nun Zayin. That would be the equivalent of 1897. And at the same time, he began to also deliver Maimorim. Those were usually shorter discourses, which is now printed, many of them, in what's called Maimorim HaKtsarim. Maimori Admur HaZaken is a series of discourses of the Alter Rebbe, which I'll talk about in a moment. And there's one volume called Maimorim HaKtsarim, the short Maimorim. These can be sometimes very short, just a few lines, sometimes a few pages. Generally, they were said before what we call before Petersburg, before Peterburg. Peterburg was the year in Tov Kuf Nun Tes, 1799 rather, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested. And then afterwards, when he came out, Yutas Kislev, which we call the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus, he began to teach and elaborate on Chassidus far more than earlier, and the Maimorim became longer, more elaborate. And this is based, of course, on the whole process that we understand Yutas Kislev as a vindication from heaven that the Alter Rebbe was doing the right thing. The arrest was a question mark. Was he doing the correct thing? And he asked them about the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, the Alter Rebbe did. Is he, when he comes out of prison, should he, because they promised him he'll come out of prison, should he continue? They said, not only should you continue, you should only expand your work. So basically, that's a benchmark in the Alter Rebbe himself, Tov Kuf Nun Tes. Once he came out, Yutas Kislev, Chabad began to really take off. So even though Tanya was written beforehand, just a few years before, that's when the Alter Rebbe. So what we have now from the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, which of course laid the foundations of Chassidus Chabad, is Tanya, which I'll talk about in a moment, elaborate a bit more, and all the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. So let me just tell you these Maimorim, where can you find them? So, the Alter Rebbe said Maimorim all the time, every Shabbos, every holiday, and many simchas, at a wedding, at a pidyon haben, at a Sheva Brachas, and so on. So with the different many occasions, he said these Maimorim orally. Besides the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe did not write his Maimorim. We have a few pieces that he added when he edited them or when he looked at them. But primarily they were written by Manichim. I'm a Maniach of the Rebbe. They were Manichim in the time of the Alter Rebbe. Chayzrim and Manichim. A Chayzer is someone that remembers. A Maniach is someone who commits to writing, to put it to paper. So the general Hanochas of the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim were written by over all his years by 5 different people in different periods, obviously. The first was the Alter Rebbe's brother, the Mariel. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib. He wrote the Maimorim. His Hanochas, meaning his transcripts, were the closest to the way the Alter Rebbe said them. So they're considered to be the most accurate as far as the language of the Alter Rebbe goes. The others are also accurate, but they are with the style of the Maniach. Who else? There was the Mittler Rebbe, as a son of the Alter Rebbe. He wrote Hanochas. You have Rab Moshe, another son of the Alter Rebbe, who wrote Hanochas. You had a Chassid, his name was Rab Pinchas Rezes. So he wrote Hanochas. There's actually a sefer called Hanochas Harap. That's just an acronym for Rab Pinchas. And finally, the Tzemach Tzedek, when he came of age, remember the Tzemach Tzedek was born Tovkuf Memtes. That would be in 1789. All right, yeah. So the 1788, because it was Tovkuf Memtes, was still the 1788. So there are actually Hanochas from all 5. You could actually find a mimer of the Alter Rebbe where you see the Mariel, the Mittler Rebbe, the Rab Moshe, Rab Pinchas, and the Tzemach Tzedek. For Rab Pinchas, we have less than from the others, but it's very fascinating sometimes to compare them, which I've done many times. The Teichen, the content is generally the same. The order can be different, and the way they present it, how an idea is presented. The Mittler Rebbe added, not his own, but he added like more explanation. Still not a Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, still a Hanoch of the Alter Rebbe. So it's very interesting, which is its own study of its own, again, the comparative transcripts that were there. This became the Alter Tzemach Tzedek, the grandson of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe had a daughter, Dvoyer Leah. He had daughter Chaim Mush. Not Chaim Mush. He had a daughter that married the Mittler Rebbe. I'm sorry. He had a daughter that married Rabbi Sholom Shachner, and they had the child, the Tzemach Tzedek. So Tzemach Tzedek was through his mother. The Alter Rebbe was his maternal grandfather, and she, of course, in the story that she gave her life for the Alter Rebbe took care of the Tzemach Tzedek. But another child of the Alter Rebbe was the Mittler Rebbe, who was his Mamal Mokim, his successor. So the Tzemach Tzedek organized at some point the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, and they became known in this form that we have Torah and a second volume, Likutei Torah. For technical governmental reasons and permissions, they have different names, but they're essentially, Torah covers everything from Bereshis through Vayakel, the end of Sefer Shmos. Likutei Torah begins with Beshalach, goes to Pekudei, and then continues the Sefer Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, the holidays, of course, Shir Hashirim as well. So really, it's 2 volumes. They're very big, Likutei Torah especially. They include over 1,000, they include many hundreds of Maimorim that the Tzemach Tzedek chose from over 1,000 Maimorim that were the originals of the Alter Rebbe. He chose. Most of them are the Hanochas of Mariel, the brother of the Alter Rebbe. But some are from others. In the back of these books, you can find whose manuscript was used to publish each of these Maimorim. So that Torah, Likutei Torah, were published back in the time of the Tzemach Tzedek. We'll get to the Mittler Rebbe in a minute. The other Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, what about the rest that he did not choose, did not put into Likutei Torah or Torah? So this became a series called Maimori Admur Hazaken. The series called Maimori Admur Hazaken, which we have today, that begins essentially I mentioned Haksarim, the short ones. Then it begins from the year Tov Kuf Samach Beis, because that's when it became more organized. Tov Kuf Samach Beis, which would be the equivalent of the Alter Rebbe passed away in the Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel 1812, 1801, 1802, is Tov Kuf Samach Beis, and then we have Tov Kuf Samach Beis, Tov Kuf Samach Gimel, Tov Kuf Samach Dalet, all the way through Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel. That would be the last year the Alter Rebbe passed away, Chavdala Tevis, Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, year 1812. It was still December time, the 24th of Tevis, in 1812, right at that time of the Russo-Franco War. He passed away in the middle of that war. The whole story is about Napoleon and the Alter Rebbe running away from him, escaping, etc. So that is in volumes. All those are volumes. Some of them are one volume, some of them are two volumes. There were Maimorim that did not, we don't know exactly the year they were said, so they're printed in that series that's called Maimorim Muzakim Parshias, Moyadim, holidays, on the Siddur, in Yonim. So the series includes the years, but also a few other volumes that include more Maimorim. Now, one other interesting thing to note is the Alter Rebbe also Friday nights, for a certain amount of years, would say a maimer explaining the Zohar of that week's parsha. A maimer that would actually explain a passage in the Zohar of that parsha, the Zohar structure around the parshas of the Torah. That became Sefer Biyurei HaZohar, that is attributed to the Mittler Rebbe, because he wrote most of those Hanochas, and then he collected them, even though they were said in particular weeks and years, but he put them in the order of the Zohar. So you have Biyurei HaZohar, Zohar Bereshis, Zohar Anoyach, Zohar Lech Lecha. So it's a printed volume that the Mittler Rebbe published. We'll talk about the Mittler Rebbe more shortly. And it's called Biyurei HaZohar. It's attributed to the Mittler Rebbe because he's the one that wrote the Anochas and gathered them, but they're Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, as he explains in his introduction. So we have Biyurei HaZohar as well. And one more thing, we have another sefer called Siddur im Dach, a Siddur with Chassidus. Dach is Divrei Elikim Chaim, an acronym for Chassidus. Divrei Elikim Chaim. This too is attributed to the Mittler Rebbe because he compiled it. He wrote these. He took the Anoch. He took my Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, said during all those years that I just mentioned, from 1802 through 1803, 1804, and so on, and he put them in the order as they explained Tefillah. So you have and Shar HaTzitzis, and Tzitzis, and Talis and Tefillin, on Hoidu, on Baruch She'amar, and so on. And throughout, and also the holidays. You have on Rosh Hashanah, you have a section on Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Chanukah, Purim, and so on. This is called Siddur im Dach. It's a thick volume. Recently, it was published in 2 volumes with fully annotated. It's a beautiful edition. And there, the editors actually mark which Maimorim come from where. So they'll say this Maimor on Baruch She'amar was said in 1806 on Parshas, whatever the Parsha was. So they trace, so even though the Mittler Rebbe printed it in the order of the prayers, they were delivered at a certain time. So these are all an output of you could call it the corpus of material, of literature that the Alter Rebbe produced. It's thousands of pages, as you can tell. This is all in addition to Tanya. And as I said, most of it was spoken and written down by the writers that I mentioned. So that's the Alter Rebbe. There, in these books, I'll talk a little about their content now. The Alter Rebbe lays out the foundations of Chassidus Chabad. As much as we say the Alter Rebbe is Chochmah, you would think Chochmah would be one akudah, like a seed. This seed happens to be thousands of pages. Just compared to the Bina and Recheves Hanor Harchava, an expansion of the Mittler Rebbe, it's called Chochmah. But don't ever think it's really short. I mean, a mimer can be relatively short. But if you look at all of them, the Alter Rebbe laid out the foundations of Chassidus Chabad, literally in all these pages. And if you want any sugi in Chassidus that you learn, can be traced to the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim. There are no Maimorim that are completely new, so to speak. There are Chidushim. Each Rebbe added, and sometimes they actually added fundamental things. But the main foundations, it's similar to Mishnah and Gemara, if you wish, where the Mishnah, and there's nothing in Gemara that's not included in a Mishnah, but the Gemara is 10 times the size of the Mishnah, because the Gemara is elaborating on the Mishnah. But every Amoira, every sage had a teacher. Similarly, it's just similar. It's just a similar. It's just a general example. It's not exactly, obviously, that the Alter Rebbe laid out all the foundational principles. So the principles of creation, Yesh Ma'ayin, Tzimtzum, Hav, Seder Shtalshlus, the Spheres, you name it, you'll find it from the Alter Rebbe. Sometimes short, sometimes more at length. And the Rabbeim that come afterwards refer. Like look in Ayin Beis, when we learn Ayin Beis, how many times did the Rebbe Rashab refer to the Alter Rebbe? He quoted entire pieces from there. Sometimes the Alter Rebbe just says it in one cryptic line, and the Rabbeim afterwards would elaborate and elaborate. I'll give you an example, the Sugya of Rishimu, the trace that was left after the Tzimtzum. So the Alter Rebbe speaks about it, more than anyone before him. But it's still not all fully developed. The Tzemach Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek especially, and then the other Rabbeim, especially the Rebbe Rashab, they take the Rishima that the Alter Rebbe begins to explain and elaborate on it. So you can find this throughout. Anything you learn in Chassidus, you can trace to the Alter Rebbe. Now, when I was teaching Ayin Beis, and in general when I teach, I always look what came before. Most of us, when we learn a mimer, we learn the mimer. It's a self-contained mimer, which is beautiful. The Rebbe says a mimer, the Mittler Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, it's perfectly fine. But if you really want to understand it well and fully, and understand how each of the Rebbes contributed to it, tracing it back to its source. We had a perfect example with Hamagbil L'Sheves. The mimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu Magbil L'Sheves, printed, Miketz, Chanukah, Torah is a mimer from Tov Kuf Nun Zayin, if I recall, or Tov Kuf Samach Zayin, maybe Tov Kuf Nun Zayin or Tov Kuf Samach Zayin. I think Tov Kuf Samach Zayin. Chanukah, the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe said of Chanukah, it's printed in Torah and then we saw the Mittler Rebbe's elaboration of 75 pages mimer elaborating on it. And when we see how the Rebbe Rashab in Ayin Beis in volume 3 based so much of it on that mimer, which is about Shema, affecting the animal soul, difference between their mitzvah Torah and their Hashem Nishmas Adam. So there you have a perfect example of Alter Rebbe, developed by the Mittler Rebbe, and then by the Rabbeim afterwards, namely the Rebbe Rashab, as we learned it. Obviously, the Tzemach Tzedek adds to it. I referred to it all in my essay and as well as when we learned the classes. So that's a perfect example of what I just said. And of course, there are many others. So any mimer you learn, it's not difficult today, especially if there are footnotes. You'll see many mimerim will say today at the bottom, this mimer is miyusad, is based on, and I'll tell you all the earlier generations of the mimerim, what was said earlier, that is the basis of this mimer that is being learned. So that lays out that. Now, let's talk a moment about Tanya in contrast to all the other mimerim of the Alter Rebbe. Because Tanya, the Alter Rebbe wrote from beginning to end. This was not a hanocha. This was not that he said it and others wrote it down. Even though there are chapters in Tanya that he did deliver. For example, when the Tzemach Tzedek was born, we're told that he said a mimer of the first 3 chapters of Tanya in the year Tovkuf Memtes. So Tanya wasn't yet published, but the themes that in the first 3 chapters of Tanya were said in a mimer by the Alter Rebbe at the Tzemach Tzedek's bris, or basically when he was born, those days. I'm not sure exactly when he said. So, but Tanya is written by the Alter Rebbe beginning to end. And of course, a question, I don't know if you've ever wondered, what's the difference between Tanya and Torah? They're both from the Alter Rebbe, but not just difference, of course, they're 2 different names, but Tanya seems to be, we call it the Torah Shebiksav of Chassidus, the written Torah of Chassidus, suggesting that everything else is Torah Shebal Peh of Chassidus, which actually in one of the Sikhs it says that Tanya was published, if you look in Tanya, you see it's published in block letters, right? Like what we call Eishis Merubois. You look at Torah and look at the Torah, it's published, its original publication was in Rashi letters. So one of the Sikhs, I think the Frierdiker Rebbe says, because Torah Shebiksav is written in block letters, like capital letters, capitalized, so to speak. Block letters. Rashi, if you look below, is Rashi letters. To differentiate, this is commentary on that. Meaning Torah Elokut Torah was more like a Rashi on the Torah Shebiksav of Tanya. That's what it says. Today, the Rebbe later, in the later years, in the 1980s, the Rebbe said to start printing everything into Oisis Merubois, block letters, not Rashi letters. So it's a different typescript. So what is the difference between the two? So generally speaking, when you learn Tanya, and you learn the introduction, you see the Alter Rebbe does not say he's laying out the foundations of Chabad Chassidus. Even though it's the written Torah of Chabad Chassidus, he doesn't say he's laying out the foundational elements. And as a matter of fact, when you read it, you see it's far more a guide to life. He actually calls it Likutei Eitzos. That's why it's called Likutei Amorim, a gathering of sayings. What sayings are we talking about? This wasn't just some compendium. He writes in his introduction, since people have been coming to him for personal advice, and it's just impossible to give everybody the equal amount of the time necessary. So instead of personal advice, the Alter Rebbe is putting everything down in writing, and he goes on to give a whole disclaimer how his writing is not going to compromise the personal experience. That's what he writes in his introduction. Because you could say, speaking to a Rebbe face to face, how could you compare anything to that? Even if it's a book he gives you, and it's his sefer, it's still a sefer, it's not the person. So he makes it clear that in the written Tanya, he's trying to capture the power of the written word, but also the spoken word, as he was giving eitzes. And he actually uses the word where he says that we're talking about b'yedei makirei kamina. We're talking about people who I know and recognize, and who know and recognize me, but mostly the Alter Rebbe knows them. So I know you intimately because of our conversations, and the Rebbe makes a whole elaborate statement that the Alter Rebbe was talking to all of us, that he wrote into a book the personal advice he would give you as if you were standing in his presence. So Tanya, therefore, in that sense, is not just Chassidus Chabad, it's applied Chassidus Chabad. It's applying it to life. It's a guide. Now, of course, there are many foundational and fundamental principles of Chassidus Chabad included in Tanya, but that's not what Alter Rebbe didn't come to lay out the philosophical foundational principles of Chabad. He came to give us a guide to living. In the Maimorim of Torah Likutei Torah and all the Maimorim Admur HaZaken that I mentioned, there he lays out the foundations of Chassidus Chabad. And there's, of course, overlap. That's not even a question. There's plenty of overlap. But the purpose of the book Tanya is to give, like he says, eitzes, advice on every matter in Avodas Hashem. Now you could say, doesn't all Chassidus do that? Yes. But Tanya is focused on that. Whereas, for example, let's take Shar Yichud V'Amunah, the second part of Tanya, or Maimorim. Some of them discuss Shar Yichud V'Amunah, obviously has practical application, but its main focus is understanding Achdus Hashem. Understanding how do you reconcile an existing world with independent consciousness with one unified God. The whole idea of Hisavas B'chol Rega, that God perpetually creates all of existence. And the same thing with many Maimorim, they talk about the Haskalah, the philosophical underpinnings, and detail, like Kav, Tzimtzum, Spheris. So in Tanya, when I'm talking about Likutei Amorim, of course, the 53 chapters, also mentions Spheris, but it's not coming to explain Spheris at length. We could derive a lot from it, because the Alter Rebbe, of course, when he wrote it with all the scholarship behind it. But you don't find a chapter that I'm going to explain the Spheris now, or I'm going to explain the Tzimtzum, even though he talks about Tzimtzum and Perek Memches and other places. And he talks about the Kav, and he talks about Seder Shtalshlus. But it all comes down to, coming to explain, like he says on the Sharblat of Tanya, that this book, this Sefer, is miyusod ala posuk ki karev elecha dover me'ed beficho b'vavcha la'asesei. The verse in Parshat Nitzavim that Moshe said before he passed away to the Yidden, that Torah mitzvahs is karev, is accessible, is relevant to you. B'ficha b'lvavcha la'aseisa, in your mouth, in your heart, and your actions. And the Vayed Hativ, this is the Alter Rebbe's words on the Sharblat, on the cover page of Tanya, to explain well, Eich hu karev ma'id. How is it accessible and relevant? Not just telling us that it is. Like I mentioned before, the Baal Shem Tov showed us that everything is karev elecha. But the Alter Rebbe taught how, Eich. The derech harucha k'tzara, in a long and short way, be'ezus Hashem yizbarach, with God's help. What I just quoted, what I just read, is exact 2 lines that the Alter Rebbe writes himself on the cover of the cover page of Tanya, which you don't find often. Usually authors don't write their cover pages. The publishers do. But here the Alter Rebbe wrote it. So you see from that he's coming to teach us a very specific, that all of Chassidus, and everything included in Chassidus, how it's cut of, how it relates to you, how it's accessible, how it's relevant, how it can be integrated in your life. In the process, of course, the Alter Rebbe uses Chassidus Chabad to do so. He explains what a nefesh alikis is and nefesh abam is. He explains the keiches hanefesh, the faculties, the levushim, the 10 faculties, the 3 garments, thought, speech, and action. The battle between the divine soul and the animal soul. The battle between good and evil. And how you achieve self-mastery, self-control, and how everybody can do so, karev elecha. And as he develops it, he continues on through Tanya, which I'm actually now middle of Perek Chof Tes. I've been teaching Tanya now a few years, I'm up to chapter 29. I should mention, just last week, an older chassid, 97 years old, passed away. His name was Rabbi Shmuel Plotkin. He's the one that actually encouraged me, more than encouraged me. He didn't let go until he convinced me to start teaching Tanya a few years ago. So he got his son to sponsor it. So I've been teaching it ever since Motzei Shabbos, a half hour. So we're up to chapter 29. So as I'm teaching it, I see exactly the unfold. I mean, I've learned it many times, but now I'm teaching it more in depth. And I see the unfolding of this blueprint that the Alter Rebbe is giving us. So in no sense, sometimes you want to appreciate something, you have to think, what would life be without it? If we only had the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe in Teireh L'Kutei Teireh and the Maimori Admura Zaken series I mentioned, if we only had that and no Tanya, you still have a tremendous treasure of material and plenty of applied material, but you wouldn't have that masterful, literally, book called Tanya. Like one of the Alter Rebbe's colleagues said, that Lev Yitzchak Berditchev said, could never imagine putting such a great God in such a small book. The idea of having one book with 53 chapters, yes, it's not short, but having a real guide to how to master your life. Nefesh Elikis over Nefesh Abamis. Again, you could derive it from Tanya, from the other Maimorim, but in Tanya it's a very methodical structure, and there's something about it that you would not really be able to fully derive from all the other Maimorim. Once you have Tanya, you can see how those Maimorim reflect on the themes, but quite that type of order and that type of structure and guidelines, like how to deal with atzvus, when you're dealing with depression or negative thoughts. So again, Maimorim talk about it here and there, but in this organized fashion, with all the details that the Alter Rebbe lays out, is unique to Tanya. Now, Tanya, as you know, is not just one section. That's what I spoke about as the Kutei Amorim. Then comes Shar Yuchid V'Amuna, which is, as its name suggests, not Eitzes as the first part of Tanya. This is more about Achdus Hashem. Then Ageres HaTshuva, whose theme is Tshuva. Then the sons of the Alter Rebbe, they published 2 more sections in Tanya. They took very relevant letters. The Alter Rebbe, another output that he had was letters that he wrote, correspondence. So it's called Ageres HaKodesh. Section 4 of Tanya is called Ageres HaKodesh. Section 5 is called Kuntres Achron. Kuntres Achron means the last manuscript. It's actually more Ageres HaKodesh that were found afterwards or added later. So the last 2 of the 5 sections in Tanya are essentially letters of the Alter Rebbe that he wrote on many different themes. So this is letters that the Alter Rebbe wrote either to communities or to individuals. Talk a lot about Eretz Yisrael, Tzedakah for Eretz Yisrael. There are the famous letters talk about that he wrote after the Ptira, after the passing of certain Tzaddikim. So he wrote a condolence letter to their community. But these are all central themes that cover different topics. And there you have, I believe it's 32 letters in Egeres HaKedesh and another 8 in Kunter Sachen, if I recall the exact numbers, something like that. Maybe 31 or 32. Yeah. So it's around 40 letters, which is the last two sections of Tanya that become all part of this Tanya. And that is more or less, and okay, one more thing since we talk about letters. What about other letters the Alter Rebbe wrote? So we have another series called Igris Kodesh, the holy letters, the holy correspondence of the Alter Rebbe, where it includes a few hundred letters that we have that the Alter Rebbe wrote through his life. And some are personal letters, some are halachic letters, some are chassidus, combination of all the above. And I think that covers, I believe, all the Alter Rebbe's output. There are, of course, stories about the Alter Rebbe, but that's already included more. I'm talking about the actual original material from the Alter Rebbe himself, not stories about him or not biographical points. There's a sefer called Beis Rebbe that gathers a very Yisaidistic, a very fundamental book that's biographical, written by Rav Hillman, that he documents a lot of the events that happened in the time of the Alter Rebbe. But that's already biography and more stories written by others. I'm talking of the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. Now, one more thing, of course, we have to add is the Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe's name is Shnei Oyer, Shnei Oyer Zalman. So Chassidus, so the Rabbeim say Shnei Oyer, two lights, the Oyer of Torah, of Primis HaTorah, which we covered, and the second Oyer, the Oyer of Nigla the Torah. He wrote a whole Shulchan Aruch. Maggid told him to write a Shulchan Aruch, which of course is based on the Shulchan Aruchs before him, namely the Shulchan Aruch of the Beis Yosef, we call Shulchan Aruch. There's the Tur, the Rambam before that, but all the other poskim, the Rosh and so on, and the Rif, the Alter Rebbe wrote a Shulchan Aruch based on that and made it even more contemporary to cover things that they didn't fully cover or that were added afterwards. And the Shulchan Aruch, unfortunately, because of the fires at the time, part of the Shulchan Aruch got burned. That's why you don't find the whole Shulchan Aruch from the Alter Rebbe. You find a lot of it, a lot of Orach Chaim, but there are entire sections that got burned. So those manuscripts were lost. Everything's Ashgacha Pratis. So we have a few things from his brother, Mariel, who wrote some things that he had heard from the Alter Rebbe or based on the Alter Rebbe. But most of what we have is, you see, quite small compared to the original Shulchan Aruch. And I think that covers the literature of the Alter Rebbe. So we covered the Alter Rebbe here. Next will be the Mittler Rebbe. We'll do that in the next class. And hopefully I'll, in the next few classes, cover this map. And then, of course, show how they, as we speak, I'll explain how they evolve from one to the next. So I'm going to stop here. Any questions?
What is the timing of the drafting and publication of Likutei Amarim versus Torah Or and Likutei Torah?
Well, the Tanya was printed in Tovkuf Nun Zayin. That would be the equivalent of, like I said, 1798, 1797. The Alter Rebbe began writing Tanya, they say 20 years before that. So that would be those 20 years, 1777, approximately. That would be Tovkuf, that's Nun Zayin, would be Mem Lamed Zayin. Yeah, a few years after the Maggid's passing, when he began to develop his Chabad, he started writing Tanya. First, he gave out manuscripts. So people had manuscripts, then they had mistakes in it, and then they finally put it together. And the first edition was Tovkuf Nun Zayin, as I said, 1796, 1797, depending when exactly. I'm not sure. I think it was Yutas Kislev, actually, maybe not. So that is that. The Alter Rebbe was saying Maimorim throughout that period, but then they were mostly short Maimorim. They're not, the Torah or Maimorim and Likutei Torah Maimorim, I would say, begin after Tovkuf Nun, around the same period. 1797 would be the earliest ones, but then it grows after basically 1800, which already would be Tovkuf Samach. So a big bulk would probably be those years. The end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. You want to put it that way. And of course, 1812 is when the Alter Rebbe passes away, so it has to be all before that. So the Torah, Likutei Torah, Maimorim, and Maimori Admur Zaken in general is those the last 20 years of the Alter Rebbe's life. Tanya is a little earlier.
Thank
All
you.
this is traced when you look in the books themselves. The publishers and the editors mark wherever they can when the Maimorim were said. Like in Maimorim Haktsarim, I believe, he there gives an overview in the introduction. What are the first Maimorim that we know from the Alter Rebbe? What is the earliest Maimorim that we have from him? I think he goes back all the way to Tovkuf Lamed. No, Tovkuf. Not sure where it begins. It's probably more like the 1780s, maybe 1770s. I think 1783 may be the earliest one. I'm talking from memory now. You have to look it up in the Maimorim Haktsarim. So they lay out a somewhat, and also what cities, where he delivered these Maimorim. Remember, the Alter Rebbe lived in Lozhne then. Later, he moved to Liadi. Those are the two main places he lived. And then, of course, later he had to run from Liadi during the war. So these are all documented in the books themselves. The details, I should say. Okay?
I've always wondered, both sets of works, Likutei Amarim and the collections of Maimon and Likutei Torah and Likutei Torah, they seem to assume that the reader has a certain base level of knowledge, at least in Kabbalah and perhaps a little bit of Chassidus. I don't know. It seems maybe Tanya a little less so. It's a little bit more general and written in a way that can relate, that anyone can pick it up and try to begin to understand it. But essentially, all of these works seem to assume the reader has a certain base knowledge. Is that the case, or
Yes,
was it
it
written
is the
for a
case.
certain? Uh-huh.
No, that is exactly the case. The Alter Rebbe wrote it for essentially someone that had Torah knowledge. Obviously, it's in Hebrew. He spoke in Yiddish, but it's all in Hebrew. So it was absolutely assumed that this was for advanced students. It wasn't for beginners.
Yeah.
When I say beginners, remember, beginners in the Alter Rebbe's time were different than beginners today. Remember, in the Alter Rebbe's time, 99.9, I'd say 100% of the Jews had learned in yeshiva.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone knew how to read Hebrew, and everyone knew Torah language. But were they exposed to Chassidus? But they were exposed to Torah. When you talk about today, we have people who never learned any Torah. Most Jews have never learned Torah altogether. So let's define what beginners means. You know what I mean? So I would say in the Alter Rebbe's times, even someone who was not exposed to Chassidus could understand the pshat. Maybe the
Uh-huh.
depth, they would need a teacher, but they saw a pasuk, questions asked, and then a beer, a Chassidus.
Uh-huh.
So these are people who learned that maybe they didn't learn Chassidus, they learned the Gemara. But they
Uh-huh.
were people who were knowledgeable in Torah language. So just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of a secular Jew didn't exist really. Meaning a secular, I mean a Jew that did not get a Torah education and didn't even know what a Parsha is, let alone be interested in hearing what the Parsha has to say, you know?
Well, obviously there was Amma Arts, but are you saying there's either anyone who would pick up a book already had the foundation, is what you're saying?
Unless they were illiterate literally and couldn't read Hebrew because they never, there were people in the time of the Baal Shem Tov we know who, because their parents died, God forbid, or whatever, they didn't have the opportunity. So they literally, like the child at the
Pretty
Kukuriku
cool. Yeah.
story, So there were people who literally couldn't read, but even they were from Jews, and they were in the environment of Torah and Yerushalayim. So I don't know, remember the Alter Rebbe's times, I don't know who was present when he delivered a mimer. I would think were probably people who were knowledgeable to some extent, or who were attracted to the Alter Rebbe. Remember, the Alter Rebbe was a tremendous scholar, and therefore he was attracting people who were Torah people. As I said again, there was no such thing as an assimilated Jew. So the only question was a knowledgeable Jew or less knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as the years passed, even the time that Tzemach Tzedek then began the Haskalah movement and began challenges where the Reform Judaism was born, by the time the Alter Rebbe, by the way, but it didn't affect yet the Russian Jews. So then, of course, then you started with a new challenge. People who are opposing Judaism. I'm talking about Jews opposing Judaism, not anti-Semite, not non-Jews. And then that's a whole nother, we'll talk about that when we get a little later into the how Chassidus addressed those challenges. I have a lot more to say on this. It's just time is limited. There's more to say. There's some very interesting studies on all of this. Again, I'm trying to be more brief. I don't want to go through everything, but as much as I can, I'll try to cover. Like, why was Chassidus revealed at that time? What was going on simultaneously at the time of the Alter Rebbe? Quite fascinating. Remember, this is the time we're talking when the United States, 1776, is almost literally to the year of when the Alter Rebbe is writing Tanya.
Yes.
So America was just becoming a country, United States of America, I should say, and the reform movement was being born literally in Central Europe, meaning Moses Mendelssohn, and the waves of what we call the emancipation of the Jews was beginning then. So in a way, Chassidus was born exactly when the birth of the roots of assimilation began. Think about that. I'll talk about that more in the next discussion.
They're almost like an antidote, but I'm sure I don't want to get ahead.
It's not almost exactly that, just for the record. Like Magdim Rafur Lamaka, yeah. Yeah. I'll just say one more thing before we conclude here. Professor Naftali Lowenthal from London, he wrote a very interesting book. I think it's on the Mittler Rebbe's Chassidus. He writes that if Chassidus had reached Europe and Central Europe in time, it would have been preempted all the isms that were born, including Reform, Zionism. We're talking about secular Zionism. All the movements, Yiddishism, that were trying to replace so-called Torah-based Judaism. Because Chassidus was so compelling. The problem was the dissemination took time. There was no technology like today. He makes a very interesting case what the world would have looked like, the Jewish world would have looked like. Chassidus caught on very quickly, but it took time. By the time Chassidus started spreading, you already had a big churban. A lot of damage was done. With the new alternative approaches, the modernity essentially diluting Judaism, which is what happened in the 18th and 19th century. Remember, many of the creative, the best minds among Jews were very attracted to the Haskalah movement, which was philosophical, rational, scientific. That whole approach, we're talking now the Enlightenment, was very, very seductive. And what they were getting in return from the Judaism was very much of a traditional Judaism that was not addressing the yearnings of the soul in an open way. So it worked in an insulated environment, in a shtetl. But once they were living freed from the shtetls, the Jews, suddenly they were exposed to all these alternatives. And what was their response? So when there's a vacuum, you get it. I'll talk about this some more. I just wanted to just put it out there. Quite fascinating.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to stop here. We're doing this overview. I hope everybody appreciates this before we go to the next text. I think it's a good idea. You just feel more familiar with the landscape, with the terrain, right?
100%.